as in all the churches of the Holy One, women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not allowed to speak, but should be subordinate, even as the law says. If they want to learn anything, they should ask their husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church. Hello, that was from the first epistle to the Corinthians, written by Paul the Apostle. Since religion throughout history has been such an important part of people's lives, it's remarkable that we see so few women as religious authorities. In my videos, I often find myself saying that we don't have the answer to a lot of the questions that we ask. And I'm sorry, but that's how it is. The further back we go in history, the less we know and the more we have to guess. But the archaeologists are really good guessers. For the majority of history, we don't know much about people's religious lives. We know that in the Paleolithic era there probably were goddesses, even though we can't really be sure that the figurines that have been found are of goddesses, or if they symbolizes something else. And we don't know who the religious leaders of the Paleolithic era were. We might assume that their religion resembled shamanism quite a bit. And of course there could have been both men and women as shamans in these cultures. But when we look at shamanism in later and even current times, the shamans almost exclusively are men. Some of the Egyptian gods had both priests and priestesses, but I haven't found very much about them. So if there are any Egyptologists here, please fill me in on this, because I want to learn. The first women that I have found that in their contacts with the gods had a real impact on the societies seems to be the Pythia, the oracles of Delphi. They were thought to bring forward the word of Apollo, the god. It's said that the oracle first was the voice of Gaia, the Earth Mother, but that Apollo came and fought the python that guarded the temple and just claimed it all for himself. But that made the unusual setup with a woman speaking for a male god. Usually women could only speak for goddesses, but here the Pythia was so entangled and so well rooted in the culture that they couldn't replace them with men. These oracles started their life in the temple at a very early age, and they kept their position for life. And even though the oracle is one of the best documented religious institutions of the ancient Greeks, little is known about the women's actual lives. They were kept in isolation and brought to the temple 7 times a year, where they sat on a tripod breathing in some probably intoxicating fumes. There they answered people's questions in front of a number of priests. People were never allowed to see the Pythia. The priests brought forward the questions, and then the priests interpreted her answers and delivered it to the people. Everyone, including Alexander the Great, consulted Pythia before starting a new quest, and she is also very well represented in the Greek literature. In my part of the world, Northern Europe, there was a strong belief that it was really unmanly to meddle with magic. Well, that's not completely true, since the keeper of the temples, the Gode, mostly were men, but there were also female keepers of the temples. Then they were not called Gode, they were called Gudja, We are now talking about the Nordic countries in the Iron Age. The Iron Age that ended with the Viking era. But one manly figure that did do magic was Odin, the father of the gods. He used magic, or the word for it here was seid. Mostly though, it was women who did the seid. These women were called völva, or plural völvor. The völva carried a staff, and the word also means staff or staff bearer. But as in many cases in history, we don't really know that much about these women. But today, at least, we recognize a grave when it belongs to a völva, because we recognize the staff. It was as late as in the 1990s when the archaeologists figured out what the staff was. Before that, they thought it was a roasting spit. Today there have been about 40 völva graves found. There are little historical material about them. There are a few men describing women doing what seems to be magical work, but most of those descriptions are from the European continent, from the Germanic countries. And of course, the cultures are very closely related, but it's still not from the Nordic countries. There's an Arab man, though, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, and I'm sorry for the pronunciation, but his records of the Vikings that he met, they are one of the richest historical sources of the Viking life that we have. When he describes a Viking funeral, he describes a woman coming forward as an angel of death, and that probably was a völva. The most writing we find about them, though, is in the sagas about the Norse mythology. From that we know that they were working women, traveling the land and performing magical rites with galder, the songs and spells they used. They were highly respected in society, but they were also feared. The völva was known for the art of seduction, even though they often were very old women. That was one of the reasons they were considered dangerous. One of the passings in Havamal, one of the oldest texts on Norse mythology, warns against sexual intercourse with a woman who is skilled in seid, because the one who does so runs the risk of being caught in a magic bond. Both the Pythia and the völva was really powerful in their religious practice. They both seem to have lived a bit to the side of the rest of society, though. My last example of priestesses did take part in the social life, and they were highly respected. For this one, we once again have to travel back to Rome and visit the Vestals, or the Vestal Virgins. The Vestals were the priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. Their well-being was seen as fundamental for the well-being and the security of Rome. Their main task was to maintain the sacred fire that was seen as the hearth of the entire Roman Empire, and that was not allowed to go out. The number of Vestals fluctuated a bit, but at its least there were 2 of them, and at the most there were 6 of them. Or perhaps 7. The historians don't agree on whether there at some point were a 7th one introduced. Most people think not. To become a Vestal, a girl was chosen at a very young age, before entering her puberty. She had to be free of all mental and physical defects. The Vestals signed up for 30 years, and after that they could leave and even get married if they wanted to. They were really engaged in the Roman society. Their presence were required at numerous public ceremonies. They had a reserved place of honor at public games. They were free to own property, make a will, and vote. And they were entrusted with important wills and state documents. Caesar's will was kept by the Vestals. They even could free condemned prisoners and slaves if they wanted to. A retired Vestal kept a high rank in society, and mostly she had no problem in finding someone to marry, since she, for the rest of her life, had both a state pension and a high rank. But most of all the religiously powerful women lost their power when Christianity took over. And still, women seems to have been more easily convinced to convert to the new religion. Why were they so easily convinced then? Well, even though my examples here were really powerful women in their culture, they still were very few. The Pythia only were one at a time. The Vestals were at the most 6. There were more völvor, but they still were an exception in the Viking society. Most women had no power to lose. And even though Christianity is a very patriarchal religion, it also has more serene rituals. It focuses on your inside and promises a better time after death. And that probably was quite appealing to a lot of women who had a really hard and unrewarding life here on Earth. I hope you learned something new today. See you soon, I hope. Bye!